obviously we have some really insidious discriminatory practices that have happened in the banking system. Okay, so that's where we've been. And that's why I think Bitcoin is such a great story, because Bitcoin allows us to turn the page. You know, we don't have to dwell on the past. We can say, okay, how do we fix this? How do we take that human bias out? We know that human bias makes people make bad decisions, right? Bitcoin is a system of rules without rulers. We can take that human bias out, and we can offer equitable access to every minority group, for every group, and also specifically those like Black and Latino investors that have been left out.
What's up, Sats fans? Welcome to Swan Signal. I'm your host, Sam Callahan. I'm the lead analyst at Swan Bitcoin, and we have another great episode lined up for you guys today. If you care about your financial future, you need to check out a couple of our offerings, including Swan IRA and Swan Private. Swan Private is our white glove concierge service where you get a trusted partner on your Bitcoin journey. We offer all kinds of education and research projects, as well as exclusive events to our Swan Private customers. Check it out today at swan.com/private. Also, Swan IRA. Swan IRA is the best way to gain exposure to real Bitcoin in a tax-advantaged account, like a traditional IRA, a Roth IRA, or rolling over your 401k. So if that interests you, check it out at swan.com/IRA today. We have with us Charlene Fadirepo. She is the host of the Bitcoin in Africa show and a Bitcoin activist. We're going to talk about all things Bitcoin adoption in emerging markets, and in Africa specifically. And I thought Charlene would be the perfect guest to have on the show. So Charlene, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. It's great to talk to you again.
Thank you so much, Sam. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So you've probably been busy, right? It's like conference season. So were you down in Miami for the Bitcoin 2023 conference?
I was. So I had such a great time at Bitcoin 2023. It was actually my third conference. So number 3.
Wow.
And third time's a charm. It was different. It was very different for me. And I think one of the things that was a big takeaway for me was that like the tourists are gone. The builders were there. It felt intimate. It felt so much more purposeful. I enjoyed it. I had an amazing time.
Yeah, that's what it felt like for me too. It's always these bear markets where all the speculators are gone. There's a lot less noise. It's not as much of a circus as prior years. And it felt like people were just head down focused, building. And I really enjoyed it for that reason. And, when I listen to your podcast and your work, you do focus on what I think is important when it comes to Bitcoin. And it's why I chose to work in Bitcoin, is to protect and support human rights around the world. And so I wanted to hear your story a little bit. How did you get into Bitcoin? I'm not sure if I've ever heard that before, but why did you choose to focus your time and energy on Bitcoin? And then maybe why Bitcoin in Africa specifically?
Yeah, indeed. So, gosh, I have to rewind a little bit. I'm a little bit of a newer Bitcoiner, but so here's my story. So I spent about 15 years of my career in traditional banking. So I'm also, many people know I'm a former federal regulator. I used to work for the Fed, so almost 5 years at the Fed. I actually, when I left the Fed, I started another company, and it was actually a wealth tech company. So I was trying to help match women of color with financial advisors. So this is right around the pandemic. I began to get questions about Bitcoin as an investment vehicle. And, when you start to get questions from your clients, you have to know the answer. So that happened. And then, my husband came to me, who's from Nigeria. He said, we should really look at this Bitcoin thing. And I took another look, and I just chose to go down the rabbit hole. Like I say this often. So I came to Bitcoin for the revenues, but I stayed for the revolution. When I looked at Bitcoin, I said, this is incredible. And having a knowledge of remittances and the broken payment system in Nigeria, we have family in Nigeria. So this idea of moving money across continent is very top of mind for me. I guess my knowledge of Africa helped me to understand Bitcoin. After that, so once I kind of made the decision to move into Bitcoin, I was blessed with a community of folks that helped me really understand how to teach. So I spent tons of time on Clubhouse, great communities like Black Bitcoin Billionaires, other communities on Twitter. They helped me to learn. And then my Bitcoin angel showed up, and his name was Jimmy Song. Jimmy Song reached out to me on Twitter and said, "Hey, do you want to be a part of a little book? I have this idea for a book." I knew who Jimmy was. Jimmy wrote the very first Bitcoin book I'd ever read, which was called The Little Bitcoin Book. So, when
Oh, wow.
famed developer Jimmy Song reaches out to you, I didn't know who he was. He said, "Hey, do you want to be a part of the book?" The answer is yes.
Yep.
So jumped on board of the Bitcoin of the American Dream team, and it was a dream team. We wrote that book in Austin in 5 days, and I think that kind of catapulted me into the Bitcoin, ecosystem. But more importantly, it was a testament to how Bitcoin brings people together. On that team, we had Amanda Cavalieri, who is a Bitcoin miner. We had CJ Wilson, who is an ex-baseball player, Gary Leland, who's the founder of BitBlock Boom, Lamar Wilson, who is the founder of Black Bitcoin Billionaires. Like all of these very different political minds and ideologies came together to wrote what I believe was a pretty amazing book that was designed to help political leaders understand Bitcoin. And after that, I was off to the races. But again, I think understanding the Africa use case made Bitcoin make sense for me.
Yeah. And we'll definitely get more into that use case for Africa. But I do want to talk a little bit about Bitcoin and the American Dream, because we were both at the Bitcoin Policy Summit about a month ago now. Time flies. But we were educating legislators and policymakers on the Hill. And that book is such a good resource to kind of give out to politicians, because it's very short and to the point. It packs a ton of information and not a lot of pages, which is what these politicians need, right?
Right.
And it's amazing, when I was giving them out to people on the Hill, a lot of them were like, "Oh, we already got that. We already have one. There's like multiple copies here. We'll take another copy." So it is kind of pervasive now throughout the halls of legislators, this book that you guys wrote. So what was your reasoning for wanting to write it? And how has obviously you've done work on the Hill too, educating legislators. So what's kind of the response and the dialogue going on that you hear when you do talk to these legislators when it comes to Bitcoin?
Yeah, so I was so interested in being a part of the book because I wanted to talk about Bitcoin from a financial inclusion standpoint. I wanted to talk
Hmm.
about the use case of Bitcoin as a tool for social justice. So there are about 8 chapters in that book. I was the lead on chapter 4, which was kind of talking about Bitcoin, as a tool for wealth building for Black Americans, for Latino Americans, for any communities that have been left out of the financial system. That was where my heart was, and I was very like um, just really happy that that narrative was extremely well received, and it continues to be well received on the Hill. Those conversations have improved. I mean, in the beginning, again, the book is almost 2 years old now, but in the beginning, the question was like, "What are you talking about? What is Bitcoin?"
Yep.
Now it's okay. Like let me understand how Bitcoin mining can help innovation. So there's been a decent amount of progress on the Hill. I think that we've had bank failures, we've had crypto exchange failures. That has created a very difficult shift in the regulatory environment, and we can't ignore that. But I am hopeful, and have been really impressed that there are some politicians that really do get it, and then others that are choosing not to.
Mhm. Yeah. And let's talk about financial inclusion a little bit, because it's something that I've studied as well. And I think it's an extremely powerful talking point when it comes to Bitcoin, especially when you think about the more progressive side of things, who seem to have a harder time understanding Bitcoin. But they do get this financial inclusion thing when you bring it up. They're like, okay, that makes sense. So can we talk a little bit about how minority groups have maybe been, um, you know, blocked from the traditional financial system, or maybe not supported by the traditional financial system? I think the data kind of speaks for itself, but I'd love, like, you're an expert in this stuff, so I'd love for you to kind of expand a little bit on that for our audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there's a lot of historical context in kind of how the banking industry has developed in the United States. I mean, we can go back, we can go back to the slavery days, but we could actually look at the past 5-10 years. The banking industry has not been friendly to communities of color. There are significant discriminatory cases. Significant Wall Street banks are paying fees every day for charging minority groups too much for loans, for foreclosing on houses in a way that's unfair and unjust, for offering credit terms that are clearly racially based when you have families that have the same high credit profile. So, this is the thing that some people dispute it, but the data is out there. Wells Fargo paid $3 billion,
Yeah.
the highest fee ever for discriminatory banking practices. This wasn't 50 years ago. This was like 3 years ago, right? And it's not just Wells, it's every bank. So obviously we have some really insidious discriminatory practices that have happened in the banking system. Okay, so that's where we've been. And that's why I think Bitcoin is such a great story, because Bitcoin allows us to turn the page. We don't
Mm.
have to dwell on the past. We can say, okay, how do we fix this? How do we take that human bias out? We know that human bias makes people make bad decisions, right? Bitcoin is a system of rules without rulers. We can take that human bias out, and we can offer equitable access to every minority group, for every group, and also specifically those like Black and Latino investors that have been left out. And I think what I always talk about is that a lot of times when it comes to Bitcoin, people want to protect folks away from the investment, and that's just not what we should do. That's not the American way, but that's just not what we should do. I mean, we want to arm people with information and education so that they can make good decisions. And one of the things that I do here in the US, I have a company, Mango Digital Strategies. We partner with corporations and we do on the ground Bitcoin education. In many
Wow.
cases, we're going into communities with low to moderate income investors. We're not telling them to be afraid of Bitcoin. We're saying, listen, let me give you the information so that you can make a good decision around Bitcoin investing. And I think that is the narrative that we all, as Bitcoiners, need to do a better job of pushing, right? It's about education and choice. We want to give Americans and everyday Africans the freedom of choice for a better money. And that better money is Bitcoin.
Well said. And these low and medium income communities, they're the ones that are getting hurt right now when we look at the banking system, specifically the consolidation of the banking industry that has happened over the last 20 years. A lot of the bank branches that have closed are in these low and medium income communities, and they simply don't have access to financial services. They don't have an ability to even save if they wanted to. And so Bitcoin's a savings technology, like you said, that doesn't discriminate, that is very accessible to anybody with an internet connection and a smartphone. There's no minimal account requirement to open up an account with a Bitcoin. You can just download a wallet. It's a lot cheaper with the fees, and you can just save in this better money, no matter what your race or gender or socioeconomic status is. So that's how this technology can be improved financial inclusion, and that's more domestically when I think about that. But you said that you have family in Nigeria, and so when you're thinking about cross-border payments, how does Bitcoin come up in your head as like, okay, this can be really beneficial for those communities abroad? That maybe have a lot of hard time sending money to family that they have in different countries. How do you think about Bitcoin in that context?
Yeah. So if you think about 85% of the world lives in the global south, right? So that's the first data point. And then if you think about Africa, we've got 1.4 billion people in Africa. Africa also has one of the most broken payment banking systems infrastructure in the world. So like you said, Sam, things like sending money to friends, paying bills, transacting as a business owner, those things are extremely difficult. They're slow and expensive right now in Africa. But that's where Bitcoin comes in. Africa closes those gaps. Bitcoin closes those gaps for folks that want to transact as vendors, or folks that just want to receive money from their loved ones abroad. One just really quick example. My husband grew up in Ibadan, which is the suburbs of Nigeria. He went to high school with a couple of friends. There's one friend that actually he came to the United States. One friend that actually stayed. And this is just a couple of months ago. His friend's wife had a baby. There were some complications with the baby, and they needed some money. The friend text everybody on the high school WhatsApp group saying, "Hey guys, my wife is very sick. She has preeclampsia. Can someone help me?" We were able to send him some Bitcoin, in a couple of minutes, and, arguably helped contribute to saving that baby's life. If
Wow.
we would have gone through the banking system, it would have taken far too long. And that is, you have things, like it's a life or death issue. Getting access to money quickly, in a way that's convenient, is so important, and it's an everyday problem, and Bitcoin is an everyday solution.
Yeah. I mean, that's a crazy story. I mean, that is an emergency, and you
Yeah,
need that money right away. Well, that's
but I
a
was
pretty
just like,
shocking story, to be honest with you. Like
yeah.
that's amazing.
And like in the United States, we can't imagine going to a hospital and a hospital not having supplies. Well, unfortunately, in some cases, and this is not always the case, in some places, if you are receiving healthcare, well, in this particular, he was in Abuja, and they didn't have the money to pay for medication. So if you don't have the money, you don't get medication. You know,
Mm.
many cases there's not health insurance, and so it's a pay to play, when it comes to healthcare in many hospitals in Nigeria. And so it is very important for you to have access to cash, so that you can take care of your loved ones. So, and I would
Yeah.
venture to say that's the case in many, many countries, around the global South.
Yeah. And you kind of you see a lot of excitement around the Bitcoin community, and some of the adoption trends that we've seen throughout the global South. I mean, you have a show called Bitcoin in Africa.
Mhm.
There was the conference out there that a lot of people got really excited about. Just the energy, they said, was really different than some of the conferences out in the West, because Bitcoin, the talk was more about like how it could empower individuals, right? How it could bring about more economic freedom. The utility of Bitcoin versus the speculative nature seemed to dominate the conversations there. And so why is it so important for you to focus on Bitcoin in Africa? And what gets you excited right now when you look at, say, some of the developments, the companies, the products? Like, what are some things that are getting you excited about the adoption trends out there?
Yeah, so the Bitcoin in Africa show, for me, is a passion project. And for me, it was important because I see my role as a witness. I want to shine a light to the people leading this incredible, Bitcoin revolution that's happening across, Africa. So that's one. And in terms of what I'm excited about, man, I mean, so many. I agree. The
Hmm.
African Bitcoin conference was different, because it's all about use case. It's all about helping people. It's all about financial empowerment. I think that the payments part, that's level one, right? That's what people get. Yeah, okay, I have access to money. I have it more quickly and it's cheaply. Great. I think what's so interesting is that this idea of Bitcoin as a financial empowerment tool has evolved. So now we're talking about Bitcoin mining in Africa. That is incredibly exciting to me. Companies like
Yeah.
Gridless Compute, Big Block Green, they are literally using Bitcoin mining as a way to bring about sustainability from a power grid perspective, but also from a revenue perspective. Your listeners might be aware of the Virunga National Park case. I think that is in, I
Yeah.
believe
Yeah.
that, yeah, I think that's in Malawi. Basically, Big Block Green put a Bitcoin mining rig on site at this national park, and created a revenue stream for that park, bringing that park out of bankruptcy. That is a game changer. That is creating sustainability in a way that allows everyday Africans to take control over their financial futures. So we don't need development arms. We don't need nonprofits. We're allowing folks to create businesses that will allow them to be self-sovereign, and that's what Bitcoin is about. It is injecting this idea of self-sovereignty so people have autonomy and ownership of their own financial future in a way that has never been possible before. We've always had some sort of intermediary. We've always had a nonprofit. We've always had an NGO. We don't need that anymore. And for me, that is kind of, it's just incredibly powerful, and it's a game changer for Africa.
Yeah, and they have so much national like raw materials and natural resources out there. When it comes to an energy standpoint, it seems like it would be a match made in heaven when it comes to Bitcoin mining. And I think it was the in Congo, the national park that you mentioned, they used access
Yep.
hydroelectric power, right? And because they just had that on hand, helped them keep their doors open. And then you have, like you said, companies like Gridless who are helping kind of bootstrap these communities almost by utilizing these stranded energy resources with Bitcoin mining. And so it's amazing developments that are happening. It's a lot of what Bitcoiners have written about, but to see it actually be implemented and be executed by these companies and actually help these communities, it's inspiring. But how do you look at maybe some of the conversations that happen in the United States around Bitcoin's energy use, mining, and then you compare it to what we're seeing on the ground in Africa of how it's helping these people? How do you get that message to these policymakers? Because it seems like there's a disconnect there between the narratives.
Oh, there's an absolute disconnect, and it's difficult. And I think the more we tell stories, I think Bitcoiners need to be better storytellers, right?
Yeah,
We're good at
absolutely.
talking about the technicals, but we need to tell the stories. We need to tell the stories about how Bitcoin is changing lives. And I do think, even if we're talking to American politicians, I do think that telling a story about how a Bitcoin mining farm is changing lives in the Congo, that's relevant. It's absolutely relevant. And so I think when it comes to the environmental story, we just have to tell that story. And for
Mm-hmm.
me, Bitcoin mining in the United States is a story of innovation and being a leader. We have an opportunity to lead, as the United States has always led when it's come to technology. But right now, as it stands, we have a ways to go. There are a lot of politicians that are not on board, and I think there's been incredible progress, but our work is cut out for us.
Yeah.
And hopefully it ends in a favorable regulatory climate that spurs innovation. That is my hope.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more about the storytelling. Stories are so powerful to win people over to your narrative instead of explaining, what's going on under the hood and how it does things when you actually hear these stories. And I think that's what you do with your podcast so well. And so I could not agree with you more. Sharing more of those stories is paramount to getting people on our side, being like, hey, this is actually really beneficial to these people. Let's hear more stories like that. So the last thing, I want to talk about is, so you do have family in Nigeria. And it's no secret that Nigeria's currency has suffered pretty massive devaluations over the last couple of years. And so they also have a central bank digital currency getting rolled out. Adoption hasn't been well there with the central bank digital currency, but they were making headlines for all the wrong reasons as the government and central bank basically tried to withdraw cash notes from them. They tried to force them into the central bank digital currency. But at the same time, Nigeria has one of the highest adoption rates when it comes to Bitcoin. And so when you're talking to family members on the ground, are they understanding Bitcoin more as they've gone through these currency devaluations and as they've kind of suffered at the hands of this central bank digital currency rollout? I would say a failed rollout. But what's the conversation like with some people on the ground there that you know?
I think, just as FTX made the conversation about custody very easy,
Mhm.
these bank, the failure of the e-naira, the rollout of the e-naira, plus this, I guess the bank currency crisis that we had in Nigeria, they've just proven the use case for Bitcoin. It made
Yeah.
it easy to say, guys, if you would have had your money in Bitcoin, you wouldn't have to stand in line, from 8 a.m. to 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. at an ATM to get only about $100 of money a day. Like, ridiculous. I
That's
mean,
ridiculous.
there were people, I saw videos of folks that pulled mattresses up to the bank branches, so they wanted to sleep there so that they can get their money again. And again, sometimes it's hard to think about in the United States, but if you are a vendor, and all you do is sell fish, or you sell peppers, or you sell something, you need to have cash on hand so you can change that cash so that people can buy your wares. If you do not have money, you do not make money.
Hmm.
Africa, like many Africa, as a continent, many of the countries are cash-based societies, and so having physical cash is important, and that's why the transition to Bitcoin makes so much sense. So, I think that currency crisis just kind of, I had a couple of conversations with folks right after it. It just cemented this idea that unfortunately banks can be trusted, you know,
Yeah.
in the context of Nigeria. And so, luckily, that conversation is okay. Well, if you can't, maybe you can't trust the bank, but perhaps you can trust yourself. Switch your money to Bitcoin and then self custody it. And so, it's tough, right? Because There's some folks that still haven't recovered financially. There's some vendors that, of course, have gone out of business because of the crash crunch. But I do think that, unfortunately, significant catastrophic events like that help push the envelope, and it helps to push adoption.
Yeah, I love that, because Bitcoin almost just has to stay the course. It can't fail itself, because all these other banks and the traditional financial system will continue to get more unstable. They'll kind of shoot themselves in the foot. And every time that there is a banking crisis or another currency devaluation, it just makes Bitcoin's value proposition more evident to the people who suffer at the hands of that currency devaluation or banking crisis. And
Indeed.
Bitcoin just has to be there. It has to be that life raft. It has to be functioning as they kind of turn towards it, and they say, okay, I get it now. So I love that kind of framing, because all we have to do is educate, basically, right? So, as an industry, when you look at emerging markets, the global South, what could we do better to help drive adoption there? Is it just education, or is there like products or services that we need to improve, do you think, to kind of make it easier for these citizens to gain access to Bitcoin? What, in your opinion, that we need to do better as an industry?
Yeah, so definitely education is step one, and step two is tools.
Mm.
So Africa. So let's talk about kind of the continent of Africa. There are actually a lot of exchanges and tools that people have at their disposal. In some cases, these exchanges work in some countries and others, but we need more. I think Bitnob is one of the kind of most prevalent.
Yeah.
Financial services companies that is in Nigeria, and there are lots of other people. I think lots of other firms. I also think we need to, for me, it's just listen and learn. I think, unfortunately, there's a tendency of the West to jump into a new space and start to talk about all the things that we know. I think Africa has done a really great job of teaching the West lessons when it comes to how Bitcoin lives and thrives. And so I think that, those of us who are doing work in Africa, I think we just have to listen and learn and just pay attention. I want to tell this quick story, Sam, because this is an
Yeah.
example of listen and learn. So my first episode of my podcast was, I think it was September 27th, 2021. Right. And so again, back then, my podcast was called the Bitcoin in Africa Show. My first guest was Bernard Perra, who's the founder of BitNub, who I know really well. On that episode, we were talking about the launch of the Lightning Network. BitNub had just launched on the Lightning Network on August 30th, 2021.
Wow.
2021. Kraken launched on Lightning April 1st, 2022. Binance has not launched. It's 2023. African entrepreneurs are front running the West, right? We have to just listen. We have to pay attention. We have to see how we can support them, solving their own problems. That, for me, I couldn't believe that. I was like, wait a minute, you guys are launching Lightning? Bernard was like, yeah, we just launched in August 2021. There are companies, there are crypto companies, Bitcoin companies right now that still have not launched on Lightning. And we know Lightning is layer two. It's the scalable way. It is how you bring Lightning to billions. So how you bring Bitcoin to billions. That is the way we get faster, cheaper, more efficient payments around the world. So there are companies that have not launched on Lightning.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, and I know, Bitnob has partnered with Coin Corner and Strike recently
right.
to help make more Lightning more accessible across Africa as well. So kudos to the Bitnob team. They're doing a lot of great things. And I think what you just said, like listen and learn from what they need, is really important, because when we say education, I think even a lot of people think that it's like, oh, we just have to teach them what Bitcoin is,
Nope.
right? But I think it's more like we have to go there, listen to them, and show them how to use it too. Like actually get down in the nitty gritty and be like, hey, these are the apps that do this functionality for you. This is how you use them, instead of just being like, Bitcoin is this, Bitcoin is that, and getting them to understand like what Bitcoin is. But how about teaching them how to use it to fit their needs? I think that would be really helpful as well. So that's the kind of education that I'm passionate about. My last question for you, Charlene, you've been excellent so far. I just want to know if you have a book recommendation for our listeners. If there's a book that you love out there, it doesn't have to be Bitcoin specific. It can be. But what's a book that you'd recommend people check out? Because I think they're kind of fascinated by your background.
Oh my goodness. I really love the Little Bitcoin book. I'm gonna go back to that. It's kind of like a
Okay.
sequel. There were so that was I think that was Jimmy's first book. They of course they can read Bitcoin the American Dream. But I really love the Little Bitcoin book because I tell you what, it gives you the global South impression. They talked about
Yeah.
Venezuela, Colombia, Nigeria. When I read that, I just said, "Oh my God, this is going to change the world." And that's the conclusion you need to come away with when you learn about Bitcoin. So I love the framing of that book. And so that's what I'd recommend to your guests.
Great. Yeah, Jimmy Song, he was really important to my own journey as well. He's got some great Medium posts. The Little
Yes.
Bitcoin book, go check it out. It's a great, you know, stocking stuffer around Christmas time as well. I like giving it out. So that's a great recommendation. Well, Charlene, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. I think what you're doing is really important. Like I said, this kind of narrative around Bitcoin in terms of promoting financial inclusion and helping those citizens throughout the world that are suffering the most when it comes to our traditional financial system, where they've been forgotten the most when it comes to our traditional financial system. I think those are the narratives that are really important to educating people around Bitcoin as a revolutionary technology. Like you said, come for the revenues, stay for the revolution. So where can people find you if they want to learn more about your podcast, or maybe just learn more about your work?
Sure. So for the podcast, they can find us on the internet, bitcoininafricashow.com. We're also on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I spend most of my time on Twitter, so you can find me at Char, Char Fadirepo, or, at any Bitcoin event all around.
Yeah, come up to say hi to Charlene. She's a great person to talk to and a great person to know. So thank you so much, Charlene, for joining us today. And make sure you follow her work. Thank you. And just have a great day. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, guys.
If you care about your financial future, you need to check out a couple of our offerings, including Swan IRA and Swan Private. Swan Private is our white glove concierge service where you get a trusted partner on your Bitcoin journey. We offer all kinds of education and research projects, as well as exclusive events to our Swan Private customers. Check it out today at swan.com/private. Also, Swan IRA. Swan IRA is the best way to gain exposure to real Bitcoin in a tax-advantaged account, like a traditional IRA, a Roth IRA, or rolling over your 401k. So if that interests you, check it out at swan.com/IRA today.